This is the story of a battle that changed naval and aviation history. And it's also the story of an aircraft from another time.
Now, our plan of attack was that we would hit the Italian coast to the northwest of Taranto.
This aircraft, with its two wings and its open cockpit, might look like something out of the First World War, but in fact it's one of the unlikely aviation heroes of the Second World War, the Fairey Swordfish. It was old, it was outdated on the outbreak of war in 1939, but it went on to achieve remarkable things during that conflict. A number of firsts, including the first Allied plane to hit an enemy ship with a torpedo. But it was also the vital ingredient in one of the most daring and innovative naval strikes of all time. It's amazing to think this was a direct contemporary of the mighty RAF Spitfire, but this was in a very different category. That engine there, less than half the horsepower of the Spitfire's Rolls-Royce Merlin. It meant it travelled at much less than half the speed of a Spitfire. But it was a workhorse, and that's because it carried this 3/4 ton torpedo, which could and did on many occasions sink enemy battleships.
The two wings of the biplane gave the Swordfish a lot of drag, but also what's called a low wing loading. Lots of wing area giving plenty of lift, even at low air speeds.
It didn't need a long runway to build up the speed and take off, so it could easily take off from the shorter decks of aircraft carriers out at sea.
The Swordfish had a metal airframe, but the skin was nearly all made of fabric.
Look at this here. This is not metal. This is linen. It's like a drum. You can see it flexing with my fingers. And this actually had an advantage. It meant that if it was hit by enemy fire, shrapnel or machine gun bullets, it could actually pass through the linen and tear out the other side without damaging the airworthiness of the plane. And so often in the Second World War, these would land back on the decks of aircraft carriers, absolutely riddled with holes.
But despite their ruggedness, it's believed that this is currently the only airworthy Swordfish still flying in the world, owned and operated by the wonderful Navy Wings Historic Flight at the Fleet Air Arms Yeovilton Airfield, the home of Navy flying. And today, I'm lucky enough to ride in the back.
And we're already in the air. It's what makes this such an amazing aircraft form. Operating off aircraft carriers, we only had about a 50-metre bit of runway we needed there. Fantastic. Somerset Level's looking very flooded beneath us. There's been a lot of rain over the last few weeks, but we've got a glorious day for it up here. It's a historic part of the country, and I'm seeing it in one of the most historic aircraft. What a treat. Even though it's an open cockpit, a design that you might associate more with the First World War or the 1920s, this does feel a step change ahead of those kind of aircraft that I've flown. It's bigger, it's more powerful, it feels more robust and, well, frankly, warlike. It's not a fast aircraft, but it's a powerful one, and you can feel it's a war machine. It's solid, it's robust, I feel like it gets the job done.
And although it was considered obsolete, the Swordfish was in active service, getting the job done across the globe, from the beginning to the end of the Second World War. Before I took to the air, I visited the other side of Yeovilton, the superb Fleet Air Arm Museum. It has a magnificent display of aircraft, including a Swordfish. I've got a burning question for curator Stephen Valentine. Why was it nicknamed the Stringbag?
Partly because of the string wiring in between the aircraft, giving it a resemblance of a shopper's string bag. It was very popular at the time, and indeed could carry anything, much like the Swordfish, which could carry one 18-inch torpedo, or a 1,500-pound sea mine, those usually strapped underneath its wings. But it could take about 1,500 pounds of bombs, although this wouldn't be a single bomb, it'd be a series of smaller 250-pound bombs.
Oh, that's okay. So it was the fact that, like a shopping bag, it was very versatile. You just
Very versatile aircraft.
And the Swordfish had to be incredibly versatile for an extraordinary attack that 21 of these apparently antiquated aircraft undertook on the night of the 11th to the 12th of November 1940. A supremely daring surprise raid on the main Italian battle fleet. In 1940, Britain faced an enormous challenge in the Mediterranean when fascist-controlled Italy entered the Second World War. Italy's declaration of war against Britain in June 1940 was a nightmare scenario for the Royal Navy. They now faced a situation in which most of the Royal Navy's fleet had to be kept back in Britain to protect the British Isles from German cross-channel invasion, whilst also dealing with an Italian threat to their many interests in the Mediterranean. If you look at a map of the Mediterranean, Italy sits like a huge unsinkable aircraft carrier right in the middle of it, astride any supply routes which Britain might use to get equipment and troops from Britain to its empire here in North Africa or the Middle East. And don't forget, in 1940, Italy didn't just mean this. Italy controlled Libya here as well. So it dominated this part of the Mediterranean. The British had to take on the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean. They had to sink their ships, submarines, shoot down their aircraft, and just try and win back supremacy in this essential theatre of war. They had one particularly important base right here in Malta, so close to Italy. They had to keep that supplied. The British also sent convoys all the way around the bottom of Africa, up through Suez, here into Alexandria, but those would also come under attack. So it became a kind of race to see who could supply their troops here across the Mediterranean most effectively. The prime Italian naval base is perfectly placed if you're interested in dominating the Eastern Mediterranean. It sits up here in this gulf, right inside the heel of Italy. A modern, well-defended naval base, Taranto. Taranto is a superb natural harbour used for millennia for trade and warfare in the Mediterranean. On the southern side lies a great bay, the Mare Grande, inside a string of small islands. And on the north side of the city lie the twin lagoons of the Mare Piccolo. In November 1940, both were full of warships. 6 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 8 destroyers, well protected and waiting for their next sortie into the Mediterranean. But the British had an idea how they could be stopped. In desperate times, sometimes the boldest plan is the safest. Rather than waiting for the Italian battleships to leave port and fight them at sea as is traditional, what if the Royal Navy deployed a relatively new tool in their arsenal, naval aviation, to strike right at the heart of the Italian fleet? What if planes armed with torpedoes could surprise them in their safe haven and sink them in Taranto? This heavily defended harbour, filled with warships, was the target for the Swordfish. To get an idea of the planning for the attack, I'm meeting with an expert on fleet air arm history, Matt Willis.
The Italian Navy considered that Taranto was a very safe base, and that was why they'd concentrated all their battleships there. The inner harbour was extremely well protected. There was only a narrow channel that ships could get in and out of the inner harbour. Even the outer harbour was fairly well protected by torpedo nets, by barrage balloons, and by quite a decent number of anti-aircraft guns. There were also searchlights available and sound detectors that could detect aircraft some distance offshore. So the Italian Navy had good reason to believe that their navy would be safe when it was tucked up in the waters of Taranto.
But the Royal Navy's senior Mediterranean commanders thought they could take on Taranto.
Oh, well, the Mediterranean fleet was lucky to have some very aggressive senior officers who were very innovative in their thinking and prepared to move beyond what the Navy had traditionally been doing. So the Commander-in-Chief was Admiral Cunningham, who was a very aggressive officer. He didn't particularly have any background with naval aviation, but he was able to see the possibilities inherent in it, and was prepared to listen to his naval aviators and actually inform him as to what they thought the possibilities might be, because the tendency of the Navy was to see naval aviation as something of a bolt-on, something to help them in their main role rather than a main strike weapon. The other senior officer, who was really quite integral to the success of Taranto, was Admiral Lumley Lister, who'd just come out to the Mediterranean as Vice Admiral aircraft carriers. So he could really take away from Cunningham the sort of detailed planning of the naval aviation side, but he was an experienced naval aviator. Between them, those two were really important to the success of the mission.
The mission was to be codenamed Operation Judgement, an audacious night attack on Taranto, carried out entirely by Swordfish operating from an aircraft carrier.
Plans for Taranto were certainly developed in view of the strengths of the Swordfish and the weaknesses of the Swordfish in some ways, because the fact that it was a night attack, it was an easy aircraft to fly at night. It was the low performance actually in some ways helped at night, because it meant that you didn't get into trouble too easily.
Cunningham and Lister were placing naval aviation at the very heart of the plan. It was a new way of fighting war at sea.
The thing that really strikes me about naval aviation is the range at which it's possible to strike the enemy. There's a great photo here, and it shows HMS Warspite, a big gun battleship built just before the First World War, state of the art at the time. These big guns can fire just under 20 miles. Next to Warspite, you've got a whole new weapons platform. You've got a brand new aircraft carrier, HMS Illustrious, only came into service in the summer of 1940. Flying from its flight deck, you can see these Swordfish aircraft taking off. They can drop their weapons, well, not 20 miles away like the shells of Warspite, but over 150 miles from HMS Illustrious. Because the Royal Navy didn't have enough battleships to overwhelm the Italian Navy in the Eastern Mediterranean, they turned to this new type of warfare, using cutting-edge techniques and ideas to destroy the Italian fleet in their harbour. Illustrious was sent right up here, just off Corfu, off the coast of Greece. Under cover of darkness, Illustrious would then deploy its Swordfish aircraft. They would fly west and then north into the Gulf of Taranto, hoping to surprise and destroy the most powerful ships in the Italian Navy at their anchors. It had never been tried before.
The raid was going to happen at night to give the maximum chance of surprise. It tested the Swordfish's versatility, with some carrying flares to confuse the enemy and light up targets, and some with bombs. But the main strike force were the Swordfish armed with torpedoes. The plan for them was to come in very low over the outer harbour, the Mare Grande, and take on the biggest ships.
It was going to require every ounce of the aircrew's expertise and their bravery as they dived into a hail of enemy fire. It's difficult to overemphasise the skill that was required, not just to navigate these aircraft to a target many miles away, but also to drop the torpedo once you got there. This is a photo of a swordfish successfully dropping a torpedo. You can just notice how low it is. They thought that to be about 30 feet to get a decent drop. That meant that some of the salt water must have come up and almost splashed the fuselage of the aircraft. That torpedo seems to be running straight and true, but if the aircraft was going sideways when it's dropped, or it's dropped a little bit too much nose down or tail down, then that torpedo will hit the sea, bounce off it, break up, and go nowhere. Some of the Fleet Air Arm Museum's most important objects aren't always on public display. I've come inside now to the aviation store. This is where the museum puts all of its aircraft that aren't on display in its extraordinary space. But I've come here because, as well as aircraft, you've got to understand the story of Taranto from the point of view of the men involved. And they've got some very precious objects here in the archive that can get us close to those individuals. Fiona Taylor looks after the artefacts in the museum's collection, including vital items from the Taranto raid, the navigation equipment used by the aircraft's observer. These were state-of-the-art in November 1940.
These are navigational aids here. So these belong to Lieutenant Goodwin, and he was an observer at the Battle of Taranto. And this right here is what is a course and speed calculator, and this is a height and speed computer.
So that's interesting, so that's clever. So it's got, you enter the speed, then you enter, by the looks of it, how much wind there is and what angle it's coming from, and then it calculates what your true direction is given all those variables.
Yeah, so observers, when they were receiving their pre-flight brief, they would have been given weather conditions and a general direction. When you're traveling to Taranto from HMS Illustrious, it's 170 miles that you've got to navigate. So you're going to have a chart that's going to sit on your lap, and you're going to have your calculator and your computer, and that is how you're going to chart your course and make your way back.
So they were also mathematical geniuses as well as being incredibly brave.
Yes, if you imagine the pressure that they're under.
It's an open cockpit, the wind's blasting, you're trying to do this complex maths when...
You're traveling 75 knots typically at a cruising speed.
For me, just getting to Taranto would have been a huge achievement.
Yeah, and then you've got a job to do.
And if the job went wrong and the aircrew came down in enemy territory, they were equipped to evade capture.
This is a silk escape map.
Right, so this wasn't actually the chart they were using to navigate. This was like stuffed in their pocket.
No.
Okay.
So this is what they would have in case something went horribly wrong and they ended up in enemy territory.
And then in one, well, like a handkerchief, there was a whole map of Italy.
Exactly. So silk is used because you can fold it up into nearly nothing. It weighs nothing. And if you crumple it up, it doesn't make any noise, which is also very important if you're in enemy territory.
Imagine navigating across a country using a silk handkerchief. The Swordfish flying on the Taranto raid all took off from the brand new aircraft carrier Illustrious, leaving in 2 waves, 30 minutes apart. The first aircraft left the flight deck just after 8:30 p.m. The rest followed in the dark at 10-second intervals. Each had a 2-man crew, pilot and observer. The third seat was taken up with an extra fuel tank to cover the long journey to and from the target that lay 170 miles away to the west. My own daylight Swordfish flight gives a small insight into what they went through making the journey to Taranto. It's quite a clear day today, but it's still November and it's very, very cold up here. I'm wrapped up in wool. They were flying in the Mediterranean, but it was November and they were cold as they flew along, approaching the Italian coast. They kept themselves warm with hot chocolates and they listened to Italian opera on the radio. It helped them follow the right course. It's very fatiguing being up here. You're exposed to the elements, it's very, very cold, you're being battered by the wind, but you're also doing a job. You're either flying the aircraft, you're keeping it in the air, or you are navigating. And then, of course, you're going into battle, the exhaustion, the terror, the adrenaline of battle. Being up here in this aircraft would have been a physical job. One of the things about Taranto that's so fascinating is the ambition. Taking these aircraft which even then were a little bit out of date, and launching a long-range strike against an enemy harbour, a well-defended enemy harbour, where its battleships, cruisers and destroyers were guarded by anti-aircraft guns and torpedo nets. They did that in the dead of night as winter approached. It was astonishingly bold and astonishingly brave for the men who took part. Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.